Welcome everybody to our Wednesday morning study session, or as we call it, the study session that shall not be named. We're here today after just talking about Buc-ee's to talk about Jews on, of all places, Broadway. So it's going to be a really interesting discussion because, quite frankly, that is a topic that could be talked about forever because, in many respects, Jews are Broadway, certainly historically. So we have a wonderful group here now. Everybody say hello. And
Hello.
we're going to invite people to bring
Hello.
their own stories, and we'll talk a little bit about the history of Broadway and how it became Jewish. But basically, and you see this quote all over the place because Broadway was so Jewish that it was almost as if you had to be Jewish to succeed at one point. And so there was really one very famous composer who wasn't Jewish, Cole Porter, and he famously said, you see this all over the place after he had a couple of musicals that didn't do well. He said, I'll write, in order to succeed, I'll have to write good Jewish tunes. And
Mm.
so that was Cole Porter famously said that. So whenever people point to successful non-Jewish composers of the early age of Broadway, they all point, well, there wasn't all Jewish, there was Cole Porter. And then the Jewish people say, well, we can look at this one thing that he said. So he was very successful. But basically, when you look at the history of Broadway, you're looking at, especially early on, Irving Berlin, Jerome Kern, George and Ira Gershwin, Lorenz Hart, Richard Rodgers, Oscar Hammerstein, Kurt Welsh, Sheldon Harnick, Jerry Bach, and Leonard Bernstein. Then you come later, you've got, of course, Stephen Sondheim, who changed Broadway, Stephen Schwartz, Jewel Stein. You look at it, so many um, that were Jewish that it's almost comical. I mean, there were a couple, obvious, Cole Porter, Johnny Mercer had some success as well. So he obviously we talk about because he's a Georgia guy. So what is the history of Broadway? We'll talk a little bit about that. And there's so much information, so we can only do so much. But first of all, what is Broadway? Does anybody know the definition of Broadway? It is, I did not know the exact definition, but it's basically has to a little bit to do with size as well as location. So Broadway is 41 professional theaters in New York. That's basically it's the highest level, obviously, of theater in the world. In order to be considered on Broadway, you have to be these 41 theaters and have at least 500 or more seats. So that's what's considered Broadway. I mean, most of you probably know New York better than I don't know. They have the Theater District, the Lincoln Center, Broadway, Midtown Manhattan, New York. They're all part of the Broadway culture, but you have to have 500 seats. If you have less than 500 seats nearby, you're off Broadway. If you have less than a smaller amount, I think 250 seats, then you're considered off Broadway. So the Broadway we know really probably came about in the early 20th, late 19th century, but there was already theater, as we know, in New York going back to the mid 18th century. So there was already old theater there where they could house almost 300 people. They had opera, they had music, and of course, obviously, they had Shakespearean theater. So this is going all the way to the mid 18th century. And remember, the mid 18th century, New York was not the center of the world as it is in many respects today. As we know, it was a major city, but it wasn't the central city of the world. In America, by contrast to Europe, obviously was second hand, or second in line, what we call it. We were still the Wild West. So it wasn't really what you call what we have it today, but there was already theater. The really at the start of the 18th century, they started to have the idea of having theater centers, but it really wasn't until the mid 19th century that we started to have the first musicals and in New York. So really 1860s after the Civil War is really when the idea of Broadway came about. Now, and we'll talk about, if people know, have more information about, please. But they had shows already 18th after the Civil War. They're already starting their first what we call pseudo Broadway musicals or shows. But really, the Broadway we know comes about as a result of other things. So again, we want to start post Civil War is when you first have the big performances. You have some before, but really most of them after the Civil War. And you start having performances like the Black Crook, which apparently is considered the first opening musical of the pre-Broadway world. So that is a year after the Civil War, and it's a very successful one. But really, vaudeville starts with a lot of Jews coming into town. So it can't start officially in 1866 because although there are a lot of Jews in America, what does not happen in 1866? Who is not living in America yet? The Eastern European Jews are not here yet. So Broadway is still a small thing, although they've got a lot of performances. You start having shows, but really the Broadway we know, in order for it to become what we know, you have to have the Eastern European immigration, which starts in 1881. So not coincidentally, the first vaudeville theater opens in 1881 in New York. And as we know, Broadway, and we think of Broadway and Hollywood or TV as completely different animals, but they're not. They're very similar in their creation because they all have basis in the same thing. It's this Eastern European immigration where you have all of these very literate Jews coming to America. They all speak Yiddish. They speak probably other languages from their country of origin. So when they come to America, they're very literate. They bring all of this Yiddish kite education. So when they come to America, what do? They start Yiddish newspapers. They start write Yiddish books, and they start Yiddish theater, which had been very popular back home and will continue to be very popular in Europe until the 20th century, into the 20th century. So they come over here, and what are two of the things that they help start that lead directly to Broadway and lead directly, one of them even more to Broadway, but also lead directly to television, radio, and movies? And the two things are vaudeville and Tin Pan Alley. And those are synonymous with the pre-Broadway world. Now, vaudeville, we know what vaudeville is. What is vaudeville? That is everything. It is theaters opening and inviting anybody with any talent to do anything. And why was it so enticing to Jews? Because there was no restrictions. Because anytime you have a startup, there's no restrictions. So there was no restrictions on vaudeville. Anybody could do it. If you got booed off the stage, you might not be allowed to go on at the next show, but if you succeeded, you would go on to the next show. This is where all the great Jewish comedians, a lot of musicians came from. And this starts in the 1880s with a lot. I mean, there's also non-Jews, obviously. Gracie Allen was not Jewish. But there was a very high percentage, not quite the percentage that we'll see in Broadway with composers and producers, but a very high percentage of vaudeville were Jews. So they start vaudeville. And then as time goes on, really in the early 19th century, we see Tin Pan Alley come about. And Tin Pan Alley has more of an effect on Broadway, probably, than some of the other things. But Broadway, in many effects, comes exactly from Tin Pan Alley. And Tin Pan Alley is one of the first places where you hear modern music, where we create American music. We're using the classical music from Europe that's still in vogue. But in the Jewish world, you have all of this Yiddishkeit music, you have klezmer music, you have religious music. Because obviously Jews in Eastern Europe were very much musicians. Every Jewish person who was a boy in Europe learned an instrument, not just the violin, others as well. And so when we come to America, you have Tin Pan Alley, but Tin Pan Alley is not based on Jewish music alone by any stretch of the imagination. What is it based upon? It's based upon the convergence of 2 or 3 different forms. And what are the forms? The forms, of course, are coming not from just the Jewish world, but from the African American world, where they're creating their own music. And that is where we get the combination of the Yiddish cowboy, which is, a famous musical and a favorite song, to the African American music that's going to be ragtime and jazz. Well, ragtime is a combination of both. So you've got this area of New York where you have people like George Gershwin, who's living in areas where you have African Americans and like Harlem, and they have their music, we have our music, and it is basically very smart people who realize we can create modern music that the masses are going to like, especially the kids. And this is where Tin Pan Alley comes in. And obviously they don't know what how the name Tin Pan Alley came in, but there's a plaque there that shows the exact area. And again, I don't know New York at all, but you guys may know West 28th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues in the Flower District, somewhere around there. Tin Pan Alley could have been some sort of derogatory remark because of, people playing pianos or music that didn't seem to match. But what you had was no laws on music, and you had Jewish entrepreneurs starting their own music warehouses, their own music companies, and you had Jewish composers who were writing the music. And you have this combination of people who are hungry for it. But you also have to know that it's not just about the music itself, it's about publicizing the music. So they would hire musicians who would basically go and publicize the music. They would go all over the place singing. One of my most interesting things is they would go to events like a horse race or a show, and they'd bring their own people and buy the tickets, and they'd start singing this music that they wanted to make popular. And then all of a sudden, people would start singing it, and as they're leaving the racetrack, they're singing this music, and it's popular. Now they're going to go to the shows or they're going to buy the music. So eventually, Tin Pan Alley then evolves, and we have jazz, we have blues, we have ragtime, all coming from these same areas in New York. It must have been a very exciting place to live musically. If any of your grandparents or great-grandparents, I don't think mine were living in that area, lived in that area, it must have been so much fun. And so this is where we get the great music, but it's not Broadway yet, because we know Broadway is different, because Broadway is the combination of the story and the music. And so what you see is that change that eventually evolves into Broadway, evolves into, remember, the vaudeville actors, the Tin Pan Alley musicians. These are the people that go into Hollywood, that go into radio, that eventually their sons and daughters will start TV. It's all the same plays. It's the art. Because why is it so Jewish? It's again the same rule for everything else. If it's a field that is open and you can do well financially, Jews flock to it. If it's the arts, even more so. And there was no restrictions on Tin Pan Alley, obviously, because you had African Americans and Jews playing. There was no restrictions, very few in vaudeville when it came to Jews. And when it came to Broadway, when it's starting up, it's not a big deal. It's the arts world and nobody cares, so there's no restrictions at all. And plus, it is Jews that are the ones who not only are writing the music, but own the music, because they're the ones who have started these companies that own the music to make money this way. So again, it's the same reason Jews were in the alcohol industry in Ukraine. Why? Because they could be in the alcohol music because there's nobody. They said, go ahead and do it. It doesn't matter to us. And so there's some great there's a bunch of books, but the Broadway musical A Jewish Legacy is probably the most famous, narrated by Joel Grey. If anybody wants more information, all of this. But what's really interesting is that even though Broadway is not a Jewish monopoly anymore by any stretch of the imagination, there are still percentage-wise probably more Jews in Broadways by far than Jews are in this country. And it's not just because so many Jews live in the Northeast. Once you are in the starting phase of something, I guess it stays in your blood and your tradition. And even to this day, some of the most important Broadway composers are Jewish, and it's been almost 100 years since. And Broadway now is very lucrative and very popular, and like Hollywood, everybody wants to be in it. So it is no longer just this Jewish-centered thing, and yet there's still a very high percentage of Jews in it. And that's because it just kind of stays a part of you. Just like some of the other areas that Jews have flocked to, like medicine opened up very early for Jews, and there still are a high percentage of Jews who are doctors and nurses because we were there at the beginning. And so it's interesting how these traditions can remain for so long. So when does Broadway really start? There's a lot of debate as to when the official start of Broadway is, but it usually often centers on a couple of famous plays. Now remember, it's when we say Broadway, it's not just musical. You have also, prose, and you have famous Jewish authors who have written Broadway shows that are not musicals. So for all the musicals, there's still a lot of, Jews who've written books that have been on Broadway, or Jews who have written short stories that have been. When it comes to Broadway, and we mentioned some of the names, are there any thoughts or questions, by the way? Anyone before we go? All right.
Well, I had a couple of comments that maybe.
Please, and then we'll get on to the origins of the first shows.
Yeah, the Tin Pan Alley, the way I heard the story, and it's in several of the books, is that, yeah, it was kind of like an area of apartment buildings where the different songwriters would hire pianists, and the pianists would be playing the songs, trying to plug them for sheet music. Of course, there was very little, phonographs and things like that in those days of records, so it was sheet music that they were plugging. And as you walk down there, you'd hear this cacophony of different sounds that were taking place, and it sounded like people beating on tin pans in this alley because all the music got mixed all together. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I think it was in the 1880s when the large European immigration of Judaism, and that was the era of the Lower East Side. And I think there were as many as something like 50 or 60 Yiddish theaters.
Oh, it was awesome. It was just nonstop.
the center of Broadway, if you wanted to call it, of other musical theater was more around 14th Street, rather than what we consider, 42nd Street uptown now. And Tomaszewski, of course, and some of those people were into Yiddish theater, and there was a tremendous audience. And you also have to throw so they had a large immigrant population that was looking to spend 25 cents to go to the theater or whatever it would cost. But the Irish had almost the same thing with George M. Cohan, where he was able to, bring some of his plays, to the Irish population. But the other part of Broadway, which was the more dignified part of Broadway, which was the 14th Street area, they did have a lot of operetta. Gilbert and Sullivan were very popular. I think they had as many as 6 or 8 showings of HMS Pinafore at one time. There were no copyrights at the time, so that they were just different, spin-offs of different kinds of shows at the time. But operetta was kind of popular with the Eastern European audience as well, and that was the more sophisticated, maybe the Dutch part of Lower Manhattan, the wealthier part that went to the opera before it was moved uptown.
Well, again, all of this true. I mean, again, Yiddish theater was the theater for a long time. Well, not a long time, but eventually, of course, people wanted to hear it in English. And a lot of those performers moved over to the next. Again, you had the Yiddish theater performers, Tin Pan Alley performers, and the vaudeville performers. These are the ones that would go on to do Broadway. And so, really, the show that changed everything was Showboat. That's considered the show 1927. It was a major hit, and it is the show that went on. It wasn't the longest running, or it may have been at the time, but I don't think it was. But it was a score with an important message and themes that really hit upon what was going on in the world. And this was really when not only Broadway became Broadway in many respects, but when Broadway became relevant. Now, you have bigger shows like Oklahoma 15 years later, but here you have shows that would lead to things like Porgy and Bess, which was another one, which would confirm what Irving Berlin had figured out years earlier, that you write your story for the masses. Even if it's a story based upon your history, you write it for the masses. And that's what God Bless America and White Christmas became. You could write shows that spoke to your history, but could be altered to really speak to everybody. And prejudice wasn't something everybody knew about. And so that's why he had Showboat, which talked a lot about that in the South. And that's why he had Porgy and Bess, which I've actually never seen, but I hear is amazing, which does the same. It's the idea that you're bringing a little bit of your history, and Jews were always the outsider. And all of these composers had parents who came here, or they came here, and they were used to being the outsiders. They found, of course, some semblance of connection in music, but outside this musical world, they were still Jewish, and if they weren't famous, they were not, they were subject to issues. So we look at George Gershwin, obviously one of the most famous, who grew up in Harlem, and they realize, obviously Rhapsody in Blue is his most very famous, but they also realized that there was a missing piece to American culture, and that was we did not have our own music. We had nothing that could speak American to America or the rest of the world. And this is where pop, jazz, and blues came about. It's no coincidence that the same year that Showboat comes out, guess what movie comes out? The Jazz Singer. You got a talkie coming out. So this idea that we're bringing all of this new music to the world, now I doubt they could have even imagined how important that music and that it would really transform music around the world. But you've got the jazz singer, you've got Showboat coming a decade or two after, God Bless America. God Bless America is more patriotic. It's not really like a pop music type thing. And now all of a sudden you get Rhapsody in Blue, you get Porgy and Bess, dealing with, African American characters and the Deep South. You've all of a sudden you've got all of this going, and it is just like a fire that has been lit. You've got Irving Berlin, who started out writing Yiddle on Your Fiddle, realizing that, hey, this is really good and I'm doing well, but I can do more if I do something else. And he does what? Alexander's Ragtime Band, and he realizes that this music will transcend the Jewish world and transcend the African American world, because obviously it's probably very complicated, as we've seen in the 50s with rock and roll. Taking African American music to the masses was a very delicate thing. And obviously, many of those musicians in that world were probably taken advantage of, and probably a lot of the music was stolen. But then you also have other Jews who are writing great musicals that end up going to the theaters first. My favorite, of course, probably a lot of people's favorite musical of all time, The Wizard of Oz, is a good example. That, you have people writing for really movies and Broadway and just writing songs. And it's a lot of the same people, mostly Jews. So any thoughts on all these things? I know Larry had some things he was bringing to the plate.
Yeah, no, I think the thing I wanted to mention is that if you watch the Jolson Story, the movie with Larry Parks, I think it is, there's an interesting scene there in which he's basically part of a minstrel show, which was also sort of a touring kind of thing. People did it in blackface. It was to kind of show how wonderful things were for the black population of the South after the Civil War. And these were touring groups that toured around the same time as vaudeville, a little bit earlier, and then they kind of disappeared. But in one of the shows, you see Larry Parks, who is in some kind of a speakeasy or someplace in New Orleans or someplace down south, and he's listening to this new music that he hears, and it happens to be jazz. And he gets so caught up in it that he misses the performance that he's supposed to be in, of the minstrel show that he's supposed to be in. Somebody comes looking for him and they drag him out of there and stuff like that. And it's like the rap was it's the same kind of thing where, rap musicals, with Hamilton and things like that have taken over, at least for the younger population. Jazz was kind of the same thing. It was sort of disrespectful. And I think you're exactly right with Alexander's Ragtime Band, that what was the Irving Berlin's real contribution was he was able to take the jazz and the song and put it together into an acceptable medium. So that he was, he was the real one that kind of put it together. The other thing I wanted to mention is that Irving Berlin was a businessman as well. And he realized that he had to control his songs, and rather than just be a songwriter and have his songs played in Tin Pan Alley and things like this. So he started the business, and he was one of the first ones to copyright the songs. And later on, we know Rodgers and Hammerstein, of course, as these great composers, but they were also sensational businessmen. And they controlled a lot of the business of Broadway in the theaters that they owned or owned part of, and also in the touring companies and in casting companies and in the movies business. And they were ones not to be taken advantage of. So that the business part of Broadway was always a big part, at least for some of the producers, for some of the composers and conductors as well, and some of the people that were outside, of that business, outside of conducting. They were involved in every facet, but business was. The main thing about Showboat was that Showboat was one of the first musicals, or maybe the first musical, that really had based on a book. It was based on the Edna Ferber book. Up until that time, you went to see a Broadway show, it was generally a review where they had a hodgepodge of different composers. Maybe 6 or 8 different composers would compose a song, and they would kind of knit a story together, almost like they did with Mamma Mia, where they took the songs of ABBA and they kind of blended them together into a make-believe kind of story. But here now it was based on at least part of a book from Edna Ferber, and it hit a lot of good notes in that story. And for the first time there was this kind of a throughput. And I think people recognize that telling the story was now becoming an important part. Prior to that, a new show came along. It was kind of a silly show with a silly plot. And if a new song came along from Tin Pan Alley, they'd throw that song in somehow into the show. Now, all of a sudden, you had kind of like a standard. I did a little study one time, and I found out that from the time of Showboat till the time when Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote Oklahoma, which is 1943, which is about 15 years, there was something like 600 musicals that were produced on Broadway. And of the 600 musicals that were produced on Broadway, only about 30 of them were based on books. So the message here is things take a long time to change usually. People didn't immediately say, wow, Showboat is the way to go, and we're going to change and we're going to move towards, this book kind of musical immediately. But people still like the idea of the reviews, and they kept it going until, as one of my classes that I teach, I ask people, can you identify a Rodgers and Hart show that is still running on Broadway or has been run in revival? Can you identify a George Gershwin and Ira Gershwin show that's on Broadway, an Irving Berlin show? It's very hard. These guys wrote like 25 shows, but they're very hard to revive because the book was so poor. The songs were great. These people were great songwriters. But what Rodgers and Hammerstein did, and I'm sure you'll talk about it, is they kind of blended the book together with the songs and perfectly place the songs so that they enhance the plot of the show as it moves along. And that's what Showboat really did. But it was this 12 or 15-year hiatus where, things were kind of in flux, and people were really still used to, well, every year I want to see a new song, I want to see a new show. And shows were not expected to last, more than one season. So it was a whole different business at the time.
Yeah, and again, it's a lot to do with, at least having a story. But again, reviving shows from 100 years ago or 50 years ago or 70 years ago, because of the wording, the way the use of language, the themes, it's really difficult to do that with these older shows because like Showboat, obviously there's some themes we're not comfortable with, same with Porgy and Bess. Oklahoma's one that's a little light and fun, so that might be a little easier to bring back. You still see that. But yeah, everything you said, Ted, is even more than I knew. But Broadway, like everywhere else, it also had ups and downs. The 20s and early, was great, and then the 30s you have the Depression, and then the 40s it makes a comeback, and then the 60s it starts to drag a little, and then 70s, of course, it's a very dangerous area. I think it was Helen Mirren who said, "I loved how Broadway used to be. It used to be all of these houses of ill repute. It used to be slummy. That was my kind of people. But now, obviously, in the 80s, it had a comeback, and it's been pretty big until obviously recently with COVID. But through that time, as you said, a lot. I mean, you still have, these great tunes you remember, from early on, but you also have more pioneering recent ones like Hamilton. And Hamilton, of course, changed everything again. You have shows like Rent, which dealt with the AIDS crisis. So you have it dealing with issues like West Side Story and the issues of the day, but you also have the fun-loving ones that are just kind of a balance of them. So, but everybody has their favorite. But what I wanted to do to conclude is look at some of the Jewish musicals, because we talk about how they were presenting these musicals for everybody. but there are also very particular Jewish musicals that became Jewish in terms of content, became very well, very successful and even loved. Now, obviously, if you're going to pick one Jewish musical, which obviously funny that the movie was directed by a non-Jew with a very Jewish name. There's one Jewish musical above all about a Jewish theme that, of course, is Fiddler on the Roof. 1964. How did this musical become popular is beyond me, because it's about a family in the shtetl, and it becomes one of the most popular musicals of all time, based upon characters from the 19th century from a Yiddish writer about a milkman. I mean, how did this become popular? It's beyond me. It's because, of course, the music and the story reaches out to everybody in a way, but there's been others. You had, Rent, as I mentioned, which is about, Mark Cohen is one of the main characters. How, it's about issues in a particular world and the AIDS crisis, and how it in many respects hit the Jewish world very hard. You have Falsettos, which I have never seen. It's about a Jewish gay couple and a bar mitzvah. So you got to imagine what would that be like. Has anybody seen Falsettos by any chance?
No.
I've heard of it, but I've never seen it. And then you also have biblical ones that made big money. How can you not make money if you have Donny Osmond on the stage? That's all I'm saying. And Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat is a huge hit, and it's based on the Bible, based about a son who's sold into slavery by his own brothers. You have Rags. It's a 1980s musical by Stephen Schwartz about Russian Jewish immigrants who come to the Lower East Side and dream of a better life, which is very similar to Ragtime that talks about, in the early 1900s about, being sick in America and being an immigrant, and all of a sudden how you end up finding the American dream. I've never seen that one anyway. What I have seen, and many of you have, of course, is Cabaret, which is a very interesting musical. How did this dark musical become so successful? Have anybody seen the movie? I've never seen the play, but it's a very dark musical before the Nazis even come into it. It's about the underground theater scene and a very strange Jewish MC at this nightclub, and the educated underground music and high life of Germany, especially Berlin. And then all of a sudden, who comes into the picture? These very uneducated, very rough, horrible people who have been, from their perspective, ostracized because they're not as educated, not as knowledgeable, not making as much money, aren't as good at everything. And now all of a sudden they're starting to be in charge, and they want access to this world that they've always heard about, but were never allowed to partake in. And when they're refused the opportunity to do that, or they feel like they're being demeaned, they fight back. And of course, in the end, they destroy that entire industry. But it's a very, and the Joel Grey character obviously is one of the best characters of all time. If you haven't seen it, it's a very, the first time I saw it, I did not understand it because I'm, from McAllen, Texas, but how am I going to know this? War Paint. It's about a Jewish woman escaping World War II and wanting to be in high society and being kind of not allowed to do that, which of course brings us to probably the second most famous Jewish musical about Jews of all time, which of course is, anybody ever heard of Barbra Streisand? So Funny Girl obviously is ironic because it speaks about a Jewish woman who was very different. Has anybody ever seen what Fanny Brice looked like in real life? if you go on to, there's a few, you can see her in YouTube videos. She was not what you would call a looker by any stretch of the imagination. Barbara Streisand is, you know, is not a tall blonde beauty like the traditional ones, but she's really beautiful. But if you go back to the 1920s to the Ziegfeld Follies and you see this woman standing next to, she was actually fairly tall, so she wasn't a height thing. She is very common looking next to these other women. And the fact that she could become a star in so many ways because of her personality and her voice is just amazing, because she really did not look like them at all. If you go online, she did not look like Barbara Streisand. I mean, she did have a big nose, but she was, so it's amazing that this woman could be, but it becomes the fact that not all not all musicals eventually have to be changed to make it more for the broader audiences. So it's incredible to see that if it's a good musical, it can still do well. So any other thoughts now? Who has here seen, and there's plenty of other Jewish musicals, but I want to make sure if anybody else has anything they want to say about. Glenn, I know you have a lot of knowledge about this, and Larry as well. Any other things you want to add?
Rabbi, one thing, I spent the better part of a Sunday morning with William Warfield, who played the lead character in Showboat on Broadway, and he was in the motion picture. He actually came to sing at Peg's church when we were living in LaGrange, Georgia, of all places. And I just spent a morning helping him to find a piano where he could warm up. And I talked to him about his character and, who he replaced. I mean, good Lord, on Broadway.
Who did he replace?
I
guess way big.
He played Emperor Jones. I could name all his plays, but I can't think of his name right now.
Okay, no worries.
It's a, elder moment. But I'll think of it probably 3 a.m. tonight, and pop up. But he was an expat in Paris. Oh God, what is his name? But anyway, it was just fascinating. He was in his 80s and his voice was still pretty good. And I've listened to recordings of him since, singing other things other than just the songs from the play, and he was an excellent musician. It's just touch the hand that touched the hand moment.
That is awesome. I wish I've only seen a few Broadway plays because I've only barely been in New York, Larry.
So yeah, you mentioned Cabaret, and I'm doing a program for Ali, a 2-part series on Kander and Ebb.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, John Kander and Fred Ebb, who are not household names. They're not quite Rodgers and Hammerstein, but if you look at their collaboration over 40 years, unfortunately, Fred Ebb died about 5 years ago. But the collaboration led to some wonderful musicals, including Cabaret in Chicago, Kiss of the Spider Woman, the Scottsboro Boys, and a good number of other musicals. But the one scene in Cabaret that is so frightening, and it's in the movie just as well, is where they're singing the song, which seems to be a very patriotic Nazi song. They're in a pub, both the girl and she's a British girl, and she's with, I think, this other fellow, and they're in this pub there outdoors, and you hear a little bit in the background about Germany and things like this. Then all of a sudden, one by one, a lot of people in brown and black shirts start standing up and start singing it, and it's louder and louder in the crescendo, and it makes the hair rise on the back of your head. It is just one of the most frightening things to see, you know, the Nazis taking over, you know, the Nazi party in the early 1930s in this what seemed to be a very naive setting, you know, a very innocent setting, and all of a sudden, boom, you know, you see, you know, what's going to happen in the future there. So it's quite startling. But Kander and Ebb are marvelous. I think they don't get, you know, people know their shows, but they don't know the name as well as Rodgers and Hammerstein and Lerner and Lowe and, you know, Julie Stein and Frank Lesser and some of those guys. But the other thing I did want to mention was the non-musical part of Broadway. And I'll just throw three names out there. My all-time favorite, obviously, is Arthur Miller. And Death of a Salesman, I think, is a play that has such value in it that even though you don't know whether or not Willy Loman is Jewish, it doesn't really matter. He's got such universal appeal. And all the characters in the show people can relate to, whether it's this father, the son, the mother, the next door neighbor, and so forth. It is just a show that just keeps repeating itself. They're doing it now on Broadway with an all-black cast, so they've done it over and over again. And the show, probably, in my opinion, the finest American dramatic show of all time. The other one is Tony Kushner. He spoke about AIDS with you know, with Jonathan Larson in Rent, and
Angels in America.
Angels in America, I mean, was truly a groundbreaking show. And then on the lighter side, of course, is Neil Simon. And you had mentioned Helen Mirren. You may have just seen the same clip on Broadway shows that I just saw on PBS where she was interviewed. And apparently they're showing a little scene from Broadway Bound. And in Broadway Bound, which is a Neil Simon play, the young guy, the son is asking his mother, he says, you know, tell me about your grandparents when they first came here. He says, oh, they came here, they saw the Statue of Liberty, and they looked at the Statue of Liberty and they said, wow, she says, are we in trouble? She says, what do you mean? She says, are we in trouble? She says, look, she doesn't even look Jewish. And she said, they're coming from Europe. So it's kind of a little bit of Neil Simon humor in that, but he has some very moving parts in many of his plays as well. But those three, you know, playwrights come to mind. But if you see a show, Arthur Miller, Death of a Salesman is just the most compelling show I've ever seen.
Yeah, and again, also I love Chicago, which is by them as well, by Ebb and Kander and Ebb. But you also, I mean, again, we all love them. I love Wicked, which is one of my favorite of all time.
Well, Stephen Schwartz, in addition to Wicked, he wrote another show that was way prior to Wicked. He wrote Pippin, of course, but he wrote another show that was interesting that was called Children of Eden.
I haven't seen that.
He takes a couple of scenes from the Bible. He takes the Genesis story and he takes the Noah story and he kind of twists it around to make it somewhat explainable. And it's quite interesting. I've seen the show done. Jane and I have seen the show done. And Children of Eden by Stephen Schwartz is something that should be revived more often.
And you know, and there's just so many. I mean, you got Philip Roth, who also, and also I've never seen Spamalot. I was actually going to go see it.
Well, Spamalot has one song in it that is so funny.
I know.
If you want to succeed in Broadway, you've got to be Jewish.
I know that's.
I mean, it is. Yeah, you should pull up that clip and show it sometime. It's really one of the funniest clips of you know, because he's talking to King Arthur about maybe we could make a Broadway type show. He says a musical, and he says no. He says, you know, we're missing the one key ingredient. We're not Jewish.
And again, it's not, you know, it's interesting because as you were talking about, it was the people who own the music, it was the people who owned the theaters, it was the composers, and of course it was, you know, the actors and singers. I mean, Ethel Merman, Nathan Lane, you know, Mel Brooks.
Ethel Merman wasn't Jewish, by the way. Ethel Merman wasn't Jewish.
She was Jewish. I've decided.
A caveat.
But you know, it was just, you know, I mean, there were, you know, and you know, they have shows that you just went. There's a show about the Leo Frank murder parade, you know. So it was really, there's a show about, you know, a woman looking for a husband, Milk and Honey in Israel in the
Oh
1960s.
yeah, Milk and Honey. Rome, Harold Rome. Yes.
So it's a combination of all of these things that made Broadway a very open place for Jews. Obviously, there are a lot of shows that failed, and not every composer was going to be, Richard Rodgers or Hammerstein or Irving Berlin, but there were a lot of them, and today there are as well. So thanks for all this. Oh, Glenn, we'll finish with you
Yeah.
because I got to go
Um,
give an invocation somewhere, so I have to end right on time.
You're talking about Spamalot. I watched an interview with all of the surviving members of Monty Python. And when they first came to the United States to do a review, there was reluctance. And one of them said, "Tell him we're Jewish." And he did, and they got the job. Also, the person I was trying to remember was James Robeson.
Oh, James, oh, of course. Oh, wow, you got to hear him sing?
No. William
That's who he
Warfield replaced
Yeah.
James
Because
Robeson on Broadway.
I think he retired shortly after that. I think he got real frustrated. I can't remember that. But you guys, as always, it was awesome. Hope you guys had a good time. And we haven't picked next week's topic. Anybody has an idea, by the way, for what to ask earlier? If not, I'll choose one and then I'll send it out, and we'll spend next week choosing some of the rest for the rest of the year.
Okay.
Maybe
great.
we'll do like preparation for high holidays or something a little bit more religious. All right, guys, stay safe
Bye.
and go watching your favorite Broadway show or favorite Broadway movie. Enjoy Nathan Lane and Ethel Merman, who is definitively Jewish, I've decided. I've always thought she was, and I cannot